Good afternoon, ladies and gents. Today I wanted to talk about one way I think we could breathe fresh life into the campaigns of our modern military shooters. Because I think few people would disagree, they've become stagnant. Over the last couple of years, we can point to multiple releases each year that have 5 to 6 hour, poorly written, set piece packed, and utterly forgettable single player campaigns. Forgettable not only because of the aforementioned bad writing, but also their environments boil down to wide corridors and their mechanics are flaccid. Don't get me wrong, there have been some standout single player shooters like Wolfenstein, the Metro series, Doom, and to a lesser extent Titanfall 2. I'm mainly levelling my criticisms at the likes of the Call of Duty and Battlefield franchises, plus some hangers-on like Medal of Honor. These games command a premium price, but their single-player elements feel like a box-checking exercise. They lead players by the nose through wide corridors choked with brain-dead AI, impotent teammates who mostly blurt out forgettable story crap and open doors for you. And let's not forget the omnipresent and, at this point, predictable set pieces. So, rather than being a purely negative Nancy about the whole thing, I thought we could look back at some older titles and one that's quite different for some ideas and mechanics that we could use to spice things up. Most of these games give players' characters an officer rank, so when I found my old copy of Brothers in Arms, it got me to thinking why we're never allowed to order our troops around in more recent titles. Having squads to order requires a broad and more varied map design so that you can actually make use of the troops under your control. Making your teammates a necessary tool on the battlefield gives you more room for them to express their characters, to actually impact on the game in other ways than just opening a door. And hopefully that would make them less forgettable. And if the player has other tools open to them to complete their objectives, it means that their own character gets to be less of a godlike killing machine, and that allows the player to feel more tension, danger, and even more of a sense of mastery when they actually do succeed. I also reckon it would help to create more emergent, replayable campaigns and introduce more room for metagames, character development, squad development in between missions, and we all love an RPG element, so why not? So first up, let's have a look at Brothers in Arms. Brothers in Arms was the first time I was exposed to an authentic but not realistic military shooter with squad mechanics. The game had you primarily controlling two different squads as kind of a platoon leader figure, and which squad you had access to would change based on the mission that you were playing. Typically, that would be a fire support section, which would be responsible for suppressing the enemy and covering wide open areas, and an assault section, which was about maneuvering around the enemy and taking them out. But also they mixed in things like tanks, which was made for some really cool situations. So the cover and suppression system in the game were central to how it worked, and they made the firefights almost like a puzzle experience where you'd be thinking about where's the best place to pop my fire support team so that it can lay down fire on the sort of optimal amount of enemy squads, so that while I'm moving my assault team through the map, they're covered and the targets that they're going to be engaging with are suppressed and unable to return fire while they're getting into position to flank. This was great because it actually made you try new things as you moved through the game, and it made you actually appreciate the map and all the possibilities therein. And also it made failure less annoying because you could experiment with the way that you were engaging with the level. When you're typically in the modern first-person shooters that we see now, funneled into a wide corridor, when you die, you can only approach it in a very limited number of ways, and so I think that makes current development teams see death as something that is frustrating and to be avoided, and not a learning experience or something that can help to make you a better player, you know, and I think that can detract from a feeling of mastery. Despite having all of these extra elements layered on top of the shooting elements of the game, that still worked really well. There was more recoil, the player had a lower health pool, and generally enemies would go down in 1 or 2 hits. You'll also notice that the player doesn't have a reticle to aim with when firing from the hip. I think this was to encourage players not to shoot at enemies who are in cover, but to get around the side of them and make the enemy present a big target and take them out that way. You'll see from the gameplay here, I'm still not sure whether your ability to kill an enemy was actually linked to the cover system somehow, meaning you couldn't kill them if they weren't suppressed or if you weren't fully behind their cover. There were some janky moments where it would look like I had an enemy dead to rights, I'd take the shot and they'd still be standing. Despite this, I still think that the shooting in this game was pretty good. One thing Brothers in Arms did really well is make smaller engagements have a level of impact and engagement that I think a lot of contemporary shooters aren't able to achieve. You don't have to be charging across Pegasus Bridge, you don't have to be storming the beachhead at Normandy or in the midst of the Battle of Kursk to feel engaged and emotionally invested in this game. Modern shooters need to inject a lot of spectacle into their campaigns, and this is because the player has a relatively straightforward job of moving through a wide corridor, blasting enemies. Because Brothers in Arms gives you more control and more to think about, a small firefight over an anti-aircraft gun can actually be more full of tension than a giant battle where you actually have relatively little choice or control over what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that in order to implement these mechanics we need to increase the lethality of weapons or rob the player character of pace or power. Dashing through environments wiping out scores of enemies is still appealing to a lot of people. What we could do instead is increase the volume of enemies, make the maps bigger and add objectives that are too far apart for the player to easily cover on their own, encouraging them to plan and use their subordinates to cover elements of the mission that they can't. I think this would result in more structured, engaging firefights, and it would actually let the supporting characters have an effect on the game and build some sort of relationship with them rather than just sort of opening doors for you or following you around commenting on how great you are as the player. Also, because there's more working parts to the game, it would be easier for the developer to encourage proper replayability or increase the difficulty in more ways than just increasing enemy health and damage. Outside of the moment-to-moment gameplay, you can also introduce a more meaningful meta game around developing your squads and equipping them before a mission, planning out how you're actually going to take a mission, and that can then inform more open level design that actually engages the player and allows them to make mistakes, experiment, and generally drink in all the effort that's been made to make the often amazing looking spaces in modern games. Having more control over your subordinates also allows you to mix things up and alter the pace of the game by allowing you to substitute an infantry squad for a tank or a helicopter or airstrikes. Having control of these elements whilst not actually piloting them allows you to appreciate their impact on the battlefield from the perspective of infantry. And again, this can make smaller engagements, just one tank or one helicopter, really devastating and impactful rather than having to fill our games full of mayhem and massive set-piece battle scenes to elicit some sort of sense of awe or emotional impact. So that about sums up what I wanted to say about Brothers in Arms and demonstrate some of those systems in action. Now I'm going to move on to something that's even further removed from the traditional shooter formula in Full Spectrum Warrior. Full Spectrum Warrior is an oddity because I can't think of any other games that actually completely remove us from controlling any one character, but instead give us multiple squads to jump between, and also relies entirely on the AI of those squads to do the shooting. Though it's not strictly a shooter, and you might be thinking, what's the relevance? I wanted to include it because I think it's another take on the modern military setting and has mechanics that could easily be put into an FPS. You'll already see the similarities to Brothers in Arms with its cover system and suppression mechanics and focus on pinning down an enemy with fire and getting around the side of them to eliminate them. However, Full Spectrum Warrior gives you much more control in the way your squads achieve this. For example, you can give an order for bounding movement where half the squad stays behind and covers the other half as it moves to the next piece of cover. You can also give fire sectors for squads to cover as they move, and you can set the way that they either conserve or consume ammunition. Another interesting mechanic in Full Spectrum Warrior is that you actually have to look after your soldiers. If someone's hit during the course of a mission, they have to be physically picked up and carried back to a casevac point for extraction or medical aid. I'm not sure if this latter point would slow down proceedings too much, particularly if you had control of your own character and were running and gunning through the level, but it would be interesting to play around with. I can imagine the casevac system being used to encourage the player to actually be a bit more cautious and methodical, particularly if there are more serious consequences to playing it fast and loose with your troop. I can definitely call to mind a number of instances in my playthrough of Brothers in Arms where I willy-nilly threw some troops in front of a machine gun or in front of a tank and they all happened to die, and I was sort of like, do I really care? I've got enough remaining resources to finish the mission, and it's not like I have to go and pick up their wounded bodies and cart them back somewhere else. So perhaps having a casevac system would be a way to make you think twice about being fast and loose with the lives of your troops. Anyway, I think Full Spectrum Warrior shows an interesting model for controlling squads who aren't in our direct line of sights. It's definitely a cool alternative to just putting waypoints on a mini-map like we saw in the original Ghost Recon. I've got to say though, playing this through again in 2016 did jar my modern sensibilities. The AI was extremely janky and frustrating at various points, as you'll be able to see from the footage I captured. The last game I wanted to look at in this video is a simple but brilliant top-down tactics game called Door Kickers. Door Kickers, again, is not an FPS, but deals with the modern military setting and has mechanics that I think would fit nicely into a AAA shooter campaign. The primary difference between Door Kickers and the other two games that we've looked at is that Door Kickers is much more about planning rather than reacting to the situation in front of you and moving a few orders at a time. The planning system in Door Kickers reminds me of Ghost Recon and Rainbow Six, but with a lot more options because you don't have to worry about controlling one of the troops. I think the planning elements you see in Door Kickers would make a great addition to our single player FPS games. They would allow us to plan before a mission and work in elements of squad customization and tactical gameplay, but also take the reins off the player when the lead starts flying. I think that introducing a planning element would help with the authenticity of games too. A lot of people don't realise that a large part of success in war is planning, logistics and careful forethought rather than heroism or twitchy skills in the moment. It's frankly ridiculous that in a lot of our shooter campaigns, our characters are thrown into missions without any prior recon, intelligence, or even a look at a map or some aerial photos of the area. Of course, it's glamorous and aesthetically appealing for the player to Rambo into a mission and boss it on the fly, but I think we're missing out on a great deal of tension, skill, and satisfaction by not expressing this aspect of warfare in our shooter campaigns. So I hope you'll agree there's some pretty cool mechanics from those games that we could put to a lesser or greater extent into our contemporary modern military shooters. Looking at it now, it surprises me that more games haven't played around with these ideas and use these kind of mechanics, develop them further with newer technology. Perhaps this discussion's well timed, seeing as the most recent Call of Duty seems to have been a flop, and hopefully they'll be scrambling around for new ideas on how to fix that. I don't think it would be a huge amount of extra effort or budget to implement the mechanics that we've talked about, it would of course demand better AI, but would mostly come down to better environment design, providing the necessary UI feedback to let players know what's going on with the squads. And for this effort, I think we'd get a lot more varied and memorable play spaces, more nuanced difficulty settings, better storytelling through the actual gameplay, and genuine replayability rather than achievement hunting. Speaking of Infinite Warfare, let's imagine what that game might have looked like with some of these mechanics put into it. First of all, we select our mission from a series of missions that are time dependent, and the longer we leave them, some of them will get closed off to us, other ones would be more difficult or have changed circumstances. Once we've selected our mission, we're looking through at reconnaissance, intelligence, images, and a map of the area. Then we load out our squads and create a plan for what we want them to do, where we want them to enter the map, where we want to enter the map. We then launch into the game, and our squads go in a more obvious way, taking a lot of enemy fire. They're armed to the teeth, but bogged down. They are, however, distracting the enemy, so we can then deploy in stealth behind enemy lines, sneaking through and disabling the enemy system so that we can then remotely guide our squads to make more and more progress and take out the enemy. Eventually, we surround the objective, meet up with our squads and take it, and then we have to do a more on-the-fly, reactive, moment-to-moment squad control as we get our squads, ourselves, and the objective to an exfiltration point that perhaps we've decided at the beginning of the mission. I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty cool to me, and a lot more fulfilling than running through a wide corridor, wasting AI that really isn't that bright. And that's just one way you could tackle that mission. I know not everyone's going to want this level of hassle, tactics, planning, involvement in the game. However, there's nothing to stop the developers from making presets, automating a lot of these systems, or even adding a difficulty mode that's just the action, like we see in RPGs that have a just the story mode. And I think we'd be surprised by the number of gamers who would actually come back to this, experiment with it, get a lot of mileage out of this. And you can't tell until you've tried, and I'm sure there will be some enterprising indie developers out there who will not necessarily take notice of this video, but cotton on to these ideas and actually implement them. So, thanks for listening, ladies and gents, and thank you for bearing with me on my initial video making efforts. Constructive criticism is definitely appreciated. Let me know what you think about adding squad mechanics to these kind of games below, and it would also be cool to hear about any totally different ideas that you've got that we could use to spice up these kind of games. If you've enjoyed, please drop me a like and subscribe for more, and thank you for watching. Until next time.